so big bad, and they lay it on the ground, and the anarchists take it and they start throwing it at our cops, at our police.
Greetings, friends. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal, the podcast at the intersection of biology and politics. You can find the bibliography for this and all other episodes of the show at againsttheinternet.com. And I earnestly implore you to find me on social media and to rate and review this podcast. It's been a little while since I managed to put out an episode, and that is because of the chaos currently engulfing the West Coast. I was a smoke refugee there for a minute, and then I was just kind of a smoke casualty for a while. But yeah, the raging infernos, it turns out that one of the consequences of global ecological collapse is that it becomes harder and harder to put out your podcast. So, you know, if you didn't have an opinion about global ecological collapse before, you really should now. But so we are finally going to wrap up this 4-part series we've been in for a couple months now, Nature, Nurture, Death Spiral. And I guess I want to talk about where we've gotten to both conceptually and temporally real quick. So in the last episode, Chomsky versus Foucault and all that, I talked about how Foucault's reasoning in that debate illustrates what I think are like these 3 really foundational aspects of a whole panoply of different social science theories and disciplines. We talked about in the last episode how even that very fact that the social sciences are so segmented into all of these different disciplines that really don't have very clear borders to them and aren't really clearly like a logical progression from one to the other, aren't foundational to or complementary of one another in any particularly explicitly clear way, how even that very fact is a product of the denial of human nature and the tendency for social sciences to just like kind of go in all these different essentially stylistic directions and have those different styles be called different disciplines. And so, so we talked about how kind of like the central reasoning underlying all of these different approaches to studying humans that involve denying human nature, which Tooby and Cosmides, all the variants of which Tooby and Cosmides call the standard social sciences model, how the central reasoning involved in any particular iteration of the standard social sciences model was really on display in Foucault's debate, and how it kind of prefigures so many of the aspects of doing politics now, of movement politics and whatnot, that are extremely frustrating and counterproductive. And so those 3 themes were radically overstating the difference between people, emphasizing language over corporeal conditions, and a sort of like obsessive tendency to interdict perspectives, to constantly be assessing what the like contingencies or imperfections in knowledge coming from one particular perspective is, and in particular what the unarticulated power relations are underlying those perspectives. So like the big moment in the debate where I was like, that is illustrative, that's how it feels to go to a meeting today, is when Chomsky says we should try to understand human nature to the greatest extent possible, and we should design a potential future society that we are trying to make a revolution on behalf of, with that foundation of knowledge of human nature in mind. And Foucault's like, no, we shouldn't. We should critique psychiatry in universities instead. And don't you think that if we try to do that, if we take that concrete action, we risk inheriting some of the flawed, contingent, unarticulated, unconscious perspectives that we have from the society we live in. We risk the legacy of that perspective inhabiting the definition of human nature that we come to, and therefore the society we try to create, which, of course, is a danger, and one should always be aware of the flaws and contingencies in one's perceptions. But obviously, at a certain point, one has to, construct knowledge based on the epistemology at one's disposal, and act based on that knowledge. And then temporally, I've been relying heavily in the last episode and again in this episode on this essay, The Psychological Foundations of Culture, by the evolutionary psychologists John Tooby and Lita Cosmides. And that was written in 1992, or published in 1992. And so temporally, like, I'd say that's about to where we've gotten. At the time that Tooby and Cosmides wrote, they called all the varieties of social science approaches that denied human nature the standard social sciences model. And that was a justified terminology. It really was very, very, very much the majoritarian position in social sciences. And so they're kind of surveying the whole landscape of social sciences and noting how essentially little progress has been made because of these fundamental conceptual sort of dilemmas. And what I guess I would say is that they kind of won. And there was no like decisive moment where a ceremony was held and social scientists the world over said we were wrong and John Tooby and Lita Cosmides were right, or anything like that. But all of these different disciplines just started kind of incorporating innateness into their work. And so at the time that they wrote, there was really, like, any time that you talked about innate human behavior, you had to go into this giant theoretical exposition justifying that such a thing even existed. And there was really, like, a relatively small handful of different approaches people would take to demonstrating it. They'd be like language acquisition, cross-cultural universals. Now, neither of those things is true. First, like, people are constantly publishing papers that demonstrate all sorts of interesting aspects of innateness, and we don't have to tear our hair out debating whether such a thing even exists anymore. And likewise, like, the number of the pieces of evidence that can be pointed to for different aspects of human nature is vastly, vastly greater than it was when they wrote their essay. I mean, it's kind of true in, like, science in general, like the difference between 1992 and 2020, just in terms of, like, the sheer volume of research that's been published in those approximately 30 years, I mean, it is incredible. Like, science is definitely, in many, many domains, there's a very exponential publishing curve. So the debate kind of ended as something that was consuming, like, the actual mainstream, like, all the different disciplines of social sciences and, like, the mainstreams within those disciplines. But that's not to say that absolutely everybody gave it up. And as is so often the case, as the belief became more isolated, it kind of also became more extreme. I've been reading a lot of group psychology papers recently, and so I have to avoid the temptation to go into, like, a huge diatribe about how beliefs reinforce group identity, and cite, like, 90 different papers. But I did want to read one quote, which is actually also written by John Tooby, but from a very different paper written much more recently. Where I think he does a really great job of describing that basic reality that I think from, I don't know, somewhere in the 90s or so on, we do see sort of defining that the increasingly small echelon of academia that still explicitly insists that there is no human nature, or works in a very strong implicit realm where there is no human nature. I think it does describe how they've just kind of, like, oriented towards increasingly counterintuitive and extreme and perhaps manifestly absurd versions of their doctrine as a kind of like reinforcement of group identity. I grew up in a cult, so I feel like this dynamic is ubiquitous, but certainly academia has tribes that are subject to this dynamic. So Tooby says of coalitional psychology, the primary function that drove the evolution of coalitions is the amplification of the power of its members in conflicts with non-members. This function explains a number of otherwise puzzling phenomena. For example, ancestrally, if you had no coalition, you were nakedly at the mercy of everyone else, so the instinct to belong to a coalition has urgency, pre-existing and superseding any policy-driven basis for membership. This is why group beliefs are free to be so weird. Moreover, to earn membership in a group, you must send signals that clearly indicate that you differentially support it compared to rival groups. Hence, optimal weighting of beliefs and communications in the individual mind will make it feel good to think and express content conforming to and flattering to one's group's shared beliefs and to attack and misrepresent rival groups. The more biased away from neutral truth, the better the communication functions to affirm coalitional identity, generating polarization in excess of actual policy disagreements. Communications of practical and functional truths are generally useless as differential signals, because any honest person might say them regardless of coalitional loyalty. In contrast, unusual, exaggerated beliefs, such as supernatural beliefs, e.g., God is three persons but also one person, alarmism, conspiracies, or hyperbolic comparisons, are unlikely to be said except as expressive of identity, because there is no external reality to motivate non-members to speak absurdities. So I would definitely say that is an easily observable dynamic in a bunch of human situations, and that really is where academia got to with it. The tiny little tribe that insisted on clinging to the denial of human nature really did start to make hyperbolic statements and like increasingly counterintuitive claims as a way to affirm group identity. And one particularly counterintuitive truth that this academic tribe tended to focus on was a sort of like elaboration on or an extension of that the three principles that we already described as being evident in Foucault and the entirety of the standard social sciences model. So this tendency to take like the idea of interdicting one's perspective and seeing what flaws or contingencies are present in it, and the idea of language being a more primary sort of like a primary like mode of analysis over corporeal reality, that really evolved into a process of kind of like really emphasizing ostensible like harms, oppressions, that would come about supposedly just like as a result of language and perspective. So this real tendency to take, for instance, the emphasis off of the United States carceral system locking people up in prison, and there being really significant racial disparities in those scenarios of incarceration, onto like an individual's personalized, internalized racism, and how their use of language reinforces the overall societal system and apparatus that does terrible things, like puts people in prison. And this tendency to engage in a very deliberate sort of active conceptual slippage, because if you're claiming that all human behavior comes out of like conceptual systems and language or whatever, if you're denying human nature and you're saying no, humans are free to vary infinitely and arbitrarily in any direction, and there's this thing, we don't know where it comes from, it's called culture, it just falls out of the sky, and it shapes people, and it's all like language and conceptual systems that inculcate like an unconscious set of rules in us that totally govern our behavior. If you're claiming that, then it's actually fairly logical to assert that all of the harms that you see from, say like an institution like racism, like all of the racial disparities you see in a society ultimately do actually originate in conceptual systems and language that everybody's using and participating mutually in the creation of, and participating more or less equally. And and that's a really different way of looking at the world than, say, thinking there are some people who lock people up in cages, and they do it in a racially disparate way, and then there are some people who don't, right? And maybe those people who don't, you know, have attitudes and opinions that are upsetting or whatever, but there's not actually a super clear, like, logically inevitable nexus of connection between how they are talking about something, or if they've like considered every unexamined perspective of, like, some, if they've considered the perspectives of everybody else in entirety or adequately. There's a really big difference between, like, between seeing that person as somebody who is using language and seeing that person as somebody who is creating a social structure that ultimately somehow puts people in jail. And I think it's probably pretty obvious when I'm talking about how these academic themes have influenced political movements, and, talking about the emphasis on language over corporeal reality and all that, like, of course I am totally talking about all the varied phenomena that get varied labels, like call out culture and cancel culture and all that. But I'm really not trying to do a critique. I'm not trying to do like the deep origins of those phenomena that get like those particular labels. I really am trying to talk about a sort of like broader tendency in movement work, and how strategies are conceived of, and like how these ideas really are shaping the behavior of political movements when they're doing things other than arguing about whether some particular form of language is oppression, or whatever, like what the appropriate degree of social exclusion is for somebody who said the wrong thing about gender on the internet or whatever. I don't want to get totally lost in, there's obviously a very vast cultural landscape of different, like, critiques of all of those phenomena. And I am talking about those, but I'm also talking about just like broader movement work. And so I will try to mostly use examples that aren't like these really egregious, and then these students said that the teacher saying that history is complex, they said that that was violence against them, and they, like, whatever, like, I'm not going to try to, go for the, like, the real freak show anecdotes. But what I am going to do, and this is one of those things where it's so often the case, I've definitely mentioned this before, that there are belief systems or approaches that don't really explicitly articulate the premise that they're operating on almost ever, and it's all just very implicit, or it's really what you're talking about when you're talking about these different, like, tribes taking different approaches to different socio-political issues, is you're talking about frames of reference. You're just talking about, like, what information and modes of argumentation are kind of like allowed in, and which are simply ignored and excluded. And like, this is really, really true with movement stuff. There are many, many unarticulated assumptions, and so you often have to like find the one book or whatever where somebody makes a really concrete version of the claims that are being often much more implicitly made in movement discussions and whatnot, in political discourse. And so like I had to do that in episode 4. I totally did that with Why Civil Resistance Works, right, where I'm essentially claiming that it's the one case where the liberal nonviolence paradigm is actually like concretely articulated, and all like the whole entire rationale is presented. It's one of very few cases, and that it therefore makes it much easier to actually talk about, because otherwise you're just kind of like grabbing at random anecdotes and making generalizations like, and as everybody knows, the moment we start talking about nonviolence, then the meeting falls apart or whatever. So I'm going to, and I know that this has been talked about very extensively, but I'm going to do a little bit of a blow by blow of White Fragility, but we're going to get a little bit freaky, and I'm going to do White Fragility in terms of Foucault, like if I did, or in terms of these three principles that I used Foucault to illustrate in the last episode. But yeah, I want to show how where White Fragility is. If you're not familiar, it's this book that really blew up because it happened to be like the white guilt bestseller right when George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police. And so you had that moment of that bewildering dichotomy where some people were like, let's take to the streets, let's burn down police stations, and some other people were like, I'm going to read this book about how my language is unconsciously racist. And so there were, admittedly, I am recapitulating a very well-worn cultural trajectory at the very moment. There have been dozens, perhaps I assume hundreds, of like YouTube videos and discussions on various, like podcasts and shows and whatnot, about White Fragility. There have been innumerable critiques. I do think, however, my critique is qualitatively distinct because it is coming from this perspective of looking at the really deep academic foundations of, like the social science gibberish that spawned the gibberish, which we are currently navigating.
Oh boy, people are going to actually take a look at this book, and then it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And
right.
There are some odd academic strains that are running through this, but
because a bunch of the basic ideas in White Fragility are actually ubiquitously present in movements, and but again, it's a much more explicit articulation of some of these ideas. So we're going to do White Fragility in terms of Foucault, or however it's best to think of that, and then I will talk about some other types of movement work, some climate stuff and some anti-police stuff. So White Fragility emerges from the diversity training industry.
D'Angelo's essays and talks have been so important and revelatory to me. I know that I'll be reckoning with my own internalized racism, with my own socialization, and trying to reduce harm throughout my entire life, both personally and professionally. And what I love about the book White Fragility is that it crystallizes so much of what I've heard her say and write all in one place in a way that I can continue to move through it.
So the audience that it was developed for is corporate employees who don't think of themselves as racists.
And none of the white people that I identify, whose actions I describe in this book, would identify as racist. In fact, I think they would most likely identify as racially progressive and vehemently deny any complicity with racism. Yet all of their responses illustrate White Fragility and how it holds racism in place. These responses spur the daily frustrations.
And so what her book actually is, more specifically than a book about race based on her experience of like whatever, doing research or whatever else she would do to prepare to do these diversity trainings in different corporations. The book is actually about, because there's a growing literature about how these kind of trainings generate backlash. So D'Angelo's experienced plenty of backlash in her day, and the book is actually about all of the adverse responses that people have had to the notions that she presents, and her theory of why those people's perceptions are fundamentally flawed, and the insidious unspoken motivations for their objections to her trainings.
I also saw how hard we worked to deny all this and how defensive we became when these dynamics were named. In turn, I saw how our defensiveness maintained the racial status quo.
D'Angelo kind of talks about racism like 12 Steps talks about addiction as a disease, where the best that you can ever hope for is to constantly struggle, to always be one very slight misstep away from relapse. Or, about like, it's kind of similar to how Catholicism describes original sin. You're in a constant process of, in a constant tension with that potential outcome. The protocol that she's selling to address racism is a totally internal, purely personal process of never-ending, agonizing deliberation.
We are so pissy on this topic. We're mean on this topic, right? And so if you're sitting here feeling that, just see if it isn't rooted in this definition. And if you cannot let go of this, you're just not going to be able to move forward.
Now, because of the way that D'Angelo defines racism, it's an inevitable conclusion that this process that she's prescribing has absolutely no conclusion whatsoever. It's infinite, right? The best that you can ever hope for in your life of perpetual agonizing is to be more aware of the racism that you will inevitably invoke and display.
Have not devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus on this topic, your opinions are necessarily very limited.
The reason that D'Angelo defines racism as such is wrapped up in the standard social sciences model. And we can start with the first of these principles that I've described as characterizing it, the radical overstatement of differences between people. So to quote Tooby and Cosmides on the social sciences process wrapped up in the debates about human nature that ultimately led to this, whenever it is suggested that something is innate or biological, the standard social sciences model-oriented anthropologist or sociologist rifles through the ethnographic literature to find a report of a culture where the behavior or whatever varies. Upon finding an instance of reported variation or inventing one through strained interpretation, the item is moved from the category of innate, biological, genetically determined, or hardwired to the category of learned, cultural, or socially constructed. So that's the initial framework. It's to find maximum variation in order to deny human nature. And then, as they say, the most scientifically damaging aspect of this dynamic has not been the consequent rhetorical emphasis most anthropologists have placed on the unusual. As Bloch says, it is the professional malpractice of anthropologists to exaggerate the exotic character of other cultures. Nor is the most damaging aspect of this dynamic the professionally cultivated credulousness about claims of wonders in remote parts of the world, which has led anthropologists routinely to embrace, perpetuate, and defend not only gross errors, but also obvious hoaxes. The most scientifically damaging aspect of this value system has been that it leads anthropologists to actively reject conceptual frameworks that identify meaningful dimensions of cross-cultural uniformity in favor of alternative vantage points from which cultures appear maximally differentiated. So that's that basic framework that we've touched on. Margaret Mead going to Samoa, Hopi people supposedly not having a sense of time, according to Edward Sapir. All the claims of these varieties. But to really understand how this system of thought can function in the present day, to create a sense that we can just literally never comprehend the experiences other people are having, you really have to understand the extent to which how social scientists defined culture as a particular kind of magical substance that is totally impervious to any attempts at analysis from any outside perspective, and how they kind of really promoted total bafflement at the behavior and experiences of people in other cultures as the only like sophisticated or valid form of understanding. Because of the way in which the standard social sciences model frames the relationship between culture and the human mind, anthropology's emphasis on relativity and explanatory particularism becomes inescapable by the following logic. If the psyche is general purpose, then all organized content comes from the outside, from culture. Therefore, if something is contentful, then it must be cultural. If it is cultural, then, by the nature of what it is to be cultural, it is plastically variable. If it is plastically variable, then there can be no firm general laws about it. Ergo, there can be no general principles about the content of human life, only the contentless laws of learning. The conclusion is present in the premises. The relativity of human behavior, far from being the critical empirical discovery of anthropology, is something imposed a priori on the field by the assumptions of the standard social sciences model, because its premises define a program that is incapable of finding anything else. The consequences of this reasoned arrival at particularism reverberate throughout the social sciences, imparting to them their characteristic flavor as compared with the natural sciences. This flavor is not complexity, contingency, or historicity. Sciences from geology to astronomy to meteorology to evolutionary biology have these in full measure. It is instead that social science theories are usually provisional, indeterminate, tentative, indefinite, enmeshed in an endlessly qualified explanatory particularism, for which the usual explanation is that human life is much more complex than mere Schrödinger equations or planetary ecosystems. Because culture was held to be the proximate and probably the ultimate cause of the substance and rich organization of human life, the consensus was, naturally, that documenting its variability and particularity deserved to be the primary focus of anthropological study. And so this vocational commitment to absolute mystification about other people gets really explicit at times. To quote from Roger Edgerton's Six Societies, the majority of anthropologists still accepted the basic idea of cultural relativism. In the 1970s, a far more radical version of the concept came into vogue, propelled into prominence by such distinguished anthropologists as Clifford Geertz and David Schneider. This epistemological form of relativism challenges more than one's ability to evaluate other cultures. It contends that cultures cannot even be compared. Cultures, this new relativism insists, are incommensurable. Each one can only be understood, or more correctly, interpreted, in its own terms as a unique system of meanings. What is more, only someone enculturated in that system can comprehend it fully. As Renato Risaldo put it, "My own group aside, everything human is alien to me." And again, we can see how massive of a leap that is from the initial mandate of anthropology seeking out the so-called psychic unity of humankind. Another anthropologist said outright, "The solitary comprehensible fact about human experience is that it is incomprehensible." And then ultimately, to defend the supposed incomprehensibility of human life, social scientists have ultimately just sort of reverted to a kind of like outright mysticism, or like a form of reasoning very akin to magic. So to read one more quote, "The standard social sciences model maintains that the generator of complex and meaningful organization in human life is some set of emergent processes whose determinants are realized at the group level. The sociocultural level is a distinct, autonomous, and self-caused realm. Culture is a thing sui generis, which can be explained only in terms of itself, omnis cultura ex cultura, according to Lowy. For Alfred Kroeber, the only antecedents of historical phenomena are historical phenomena." Durkheim was equally emphatic. "The determining cause of a social fact should be sought among the social facts preceding it, and not among the states of individual consciousness." That is, phenomena at the sociocultural level are mostly or entirely caused by other phenomena at the sociocultural level. It must be emphasized that this claim is not merely the obvious point that social phenomena such as tulip bulb mania, the contagious trajectory of deconstructionist fashions, or the principles of supply and demand cannot be understood simply by pointing inside the head of a single individual. It is instead a claim about the generator of the rich organization everywhere apparent in human life. What is generated even includes individual adult psychological phenomena, which are themselves simply additional social constructs. So putting that all together, you can't look at actual humans or their actual behavior as a source of explanation about humans and their behavior. You have to exclusively look at these like group level processes, but then at the same time they militate against the notion that you can ever understand these group level processes, that you can ever comprehend this thing that is culture that they keep referring to. And so obviously this started as a social sciences tradition with anthropologists and the like going to places that they felt were remote from the world that they knew and where they assumed they would find maximum differentiation, maximum cultural divergence from everything that was familiar, and then kind of reporting the results to an audience it seems that they largely assumed would never have contact with the peoples they were describing, thus leaving a tremendous margin of error for like very, very liberal interpretations. But at some point, this precise mode of thinking started getting applied to other sociological categories within a given society. And it's interesting because academics really don't seem to care about whole vast classes of really interesting, significant differences between people. Like I just don't think that there's nearly as many papers on like people who were abused as children as like a social class, or like people who are incarcerated or who were incarcerated. It very much does fall along. It doesn't fall along. What's interesting about it is that it truly never does fall along lines of like of people who are defined by a thing that they actually experienced. It's always like broader demographic. So, it's basically race and sexual orientation and gender. And then academics like to use the term class, but it doesn't really seem like they actually like look at it all that much. But so academics started to undertake this exact same process that they had been doing with, Samoans and Hopi people with groups within a given society that are having contact with each other and speaking the same language and stuff like that. And then at the same time insisting essentially in the anthropological tradition that not only are these groups infinitely or arbitrarily different from one another, but that attempts to concretely understand the differences or the experiences that other groups are having are essentially idiotic, reductionist, hopeless affairs that perpetually just reiterating our bafflement and our inability to understand people is like the least harmful and the most the most kind of like wise and aware framework that one can operate in.
Let me just tell you, when I hear this from a white person, and I hear it frequently, there's a bubble over my head. And it has a few things in it. The first thing is, this person doesn't understand basic socialization. This person doesn't understand culture. This person is not particularly self-aware.
So the most singularly idiotic thing that one can do in this framework is to try to understand anything about anybody who belongs to any other group as social sciences have defined them, or to make any statements about humanity in general.
At the same time, this idea that we don't speak from any particular position, but speak for all of humanity.
Now, of course, nobody does actually speak for all of humanity, so it's not absurd to say that nobody speaks for all of humanity. But the point is, what D'Angelo is actually saying is not only that, but that it's absurd and somehow inevitably oppressive or will result in catastrophe to literally just try to comprehend one another's experiences. And this has a bunch of really weird consequences with respect to, for instance, different racial groups. It both creates a level of absolute difference between people of different ethnicities that in many cases probably really isn't there, but it also ends up implicitly insisting on a bunch of homogeneity that also really isn't there. And we see how this becomes, like if these different sociological groups are subject to these different cultures, and culture is this mysterious thing that shapes our perceptions to an infinite arbitrary degree, then we can also assume that people in different groups are going to have more of a shared perspective or less variation between them than they actually do.
Now, how can I say that when I don't know most of the people in this room? And this, of course, is the first thing that tends to trigger white fragility, generalizing about white people. As a sociologist, I'm really comfortable generalizing about white people.
And so this comes up over and over again, for instance, in mobilizations against police violence, because over and over again, there is something that's described as like the Black experience of dealing with the police. And it's conceptually distinct. It lives in a totally different universe than any white person's experience of dealing with the police. But also it's implied and assumed that Black people in general share some perspective on the police or on the politics around incarceration. And so that sets up the situation over and over and over again, where a couple really prominent Black people can say, we're the community leaders and we want everybody to stand on the sidewalk and wave signs and stop being angry and fighting the police or whatever. And that comes out of this framework. And then the final really interesting consequence to note of this is that it becomes a more favorable, less harmful approach to take, rather than to, for instance, if you see, people being incarcerated disproportionately based on race, to fight back against that physical condition becomes less virtuous than assuming that you so poorly comprehend the experiences of other people that it would be better if you did nothing in the physical world and just spent all your time contemplating your inability to understand other people.
Wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions.
And so because we are utterly haplessly subject to whatever shape culture, this thing that we can't comprehend, wants to give to us, the situation is pretty hopeless.
Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves.
As a consequence, we should never evaluate our unique perspectives and other contingencies and then look at other people's perspectives and all their unique contingencies and try to see what seems true for all of us, to try to come to any kind of consensus or to ever try to articulate statements that are generally true for people in some fundamental sense, rather than an expression of group identity. We should only ever ask what anybody is saying says about their group identity.
And there's a question that has never failed me in my efforts to uncover how we pull this off. Right? And that question is not, is this true or is this false? Because if we apply that question, we're going to argue and argue and argue. The question that has never failed me is, how do these narratives function in the conversation?
Okay, so we're abandoning the notion of truth, and we're abandoning the notion of mutual comprehension. So that takes a lot of things off the table as far as conceivable responses to racism. It seems like probably pretty implausible, for instance, to form a coalition and advocate for policy goals and do direct action or have a revolution and burn the prisons and free all the prisoners or whatever. sounds more like we should do something like focus on the language that we use. That's about what we're restricted to at this point. And that's sort of essentially what, as far as I can tell, Robin DiAngelo is advocating constitutes a response to racism. It's an internal process, and the only external manifestation is how you use language.
Remove from your vocabulary anything on the topic of race that begins with just happen to be.
And so this gets into, like I was saying, the core, the second principle, the characteristic of the standard social sciences model as it was once known, this hyper emphasis on language at the expense of corporeal conditions, and this kind of notion that any given behavior that you see emerging from like anywhere in society has its origins in an unknowable conceptual linguistic system that everybody is subject to and everybody is participating in equally, and therefore it is very much as if our language can magically be translated into, say, a prison.
It's a manifestation of racism that well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are more likely to exhibit. It exists under the surface of consciousness because it conflicts with consciously held beliefs of racial equity and justice. Aversive racism is a subtle but insidious form, as aversive racists enact racism in ways that allow them to maintain a positive self-image, e.g., I have lots of friends of color.
The hyper-emphasis on language, the second theme kind of comes about through the first. You start by radically overstating the differences between people, but then this is countered by people saying like, well, look at the regularities too. Look at how there's families and marriage and sexual jealousy. Look at how these things are very recurrent in different human societies. And so then in order to claim these radical differences, one has to kind of like look at people doing relatively similar things all over the world and conceptualize them as radically different, which means looking at how people talk about things and being like, well, these are totally non-overlapping domains, which is the exact opposite of a good scientific principle. If you see people engaging in the same behavior in all of these different contexts, and they invoke different justifications or reasons for that behavior, that's not an indication that's a very powerful indication that there is some shared behavioral imperative there, and that people invoke different justifications for it. So, as Tooby and Cosmides say, certainly one of the most rewarded of talents inside anthropology is the literary ability to express the humanly familiar and intelligible as the exotic. Yeah, and so that's really like the classic substance of anthropology, is this literary experiment where, it's like, oh, this culture you think has marriage? Well, that's because you're thinking of it in terms unconsciously inherited from your own cultural framework. In reality, the thing that you think is marriage in this culture is conceived of not as a union of individuals, but as an exchange of the essential, like the vital force of life from the heavens to the earth, or, whatever. And so therefore, the very material fact that it also involves two people living together in like a publicly recognized union where they are either monogamous or certainly somewhat sexually restrictive, and they have offspring together, like let's just ignore all of that because of these like conceptual differences. And so that's like kind of been anthropology's sort of primary endeavor for as long as it's existed, for a lot of the anthropological tendency. This obsession with language certainly evident in Michel Foucault's famous statement that language is oppression, and so like that's really been the evolution. The hyper emphasis on language has been around for a long time, and kicked in the 20th century in the social sciences debates. But the notion of language actually being a cause of harm in and of itself, like this slippage from thinking of like a cultural system or a cultural framework that uses language in a particular way that also manifests in these other, physical ways that are harmful or destructive, and like, transitioning from the notion that your language supports those systems or reinforces or validates or perpetuates them to the idea that language itself just is the form of harm that we should be the very most concerned with. This form of racism that's unconscious and primarily involves how people use language, turns out it's the very worst kind.
White progressives do indeed uphold and perpetrate racism, but our defensiveness and certitude make it virtually impossible to explain to us how we do so. So I'm pretty sure I'm speaking to a room filled with white progressives.
D'Angelo then goes on to say that white progressives exhibiting the type of racism she's describing do the most harm. And this is, I think, where it really becomes evident that the system of thinking that she's perpetuating ultimately does rely on like some actual magical foundations, like some true sorcery and a real like militant desire to articulate principles in a realm that has no connection with physical reality whatsoever. This is where the book, whatever one thinks of it before this point, like, it just becomes utterly shocking to encounter this claim that in a society where people are being hunted down and caged and murdered at a hugely racially disproportionate rate by the state, that the people who are doing the most harm to people who are disproportionately subject to these conditions are people who talk about that fact in a way that's insensitive. That is fucking wild.
Usually some form of eye rolling, and actually I recently co-facilitated with a black woman who said, that is the most dangerous white person to me.
And then, of course, the third theme that we've articulated from the standard social sciences model, the perpetual interdiction of perspective, the ceaseless referring back to contingencies or flaws in knowledge rather than ever trying to just define what our knowledge is given our limited perspectives, is very much present throughout White Fragility.
Right? So it's not functioning the way we think it is, and this is another piece of humility for us. We are the least qualified to determine whether we understand this or not.
And I guess I hope that it's probably pretty evident that all three of these sort of like basic tendencies that I described as defining those social sciences approaches, I mean, they all are ultimately one approach. They all just have the fundamental common denominator of mystification. They are all about claiming that a statement of like knowledge or inference or causal relationship or continuity between two observable phenomena is beyond our comprehension. And, it's all just like the endless repetitions of this framework where people were making all these observations about humans that seem to indicate some pretty like decisive things about our nature and the similarities between all human groups. And social scientists were just kind of left with this like with one rhetorical trick, but endless variations on that rhetorical trick. Whole libraries full of hyper dense language that is all just a variation on saying like, but how much do you ultimately know? But how certain can you be of anything? But are you bringing a flawed perspective into your analysis? Just ad infinitum.
Challenge to universalism, right? Suggesting that maybe in fact we don't speak for all of humanity. We speak from a particular perspective, and it's deeply limited.
So that's White Fragility in terms of the major themes of 20th century social constructivism. And now you always have that handy for whenever you're thinking about whether you're meeting your racial shame quotient while you're stepping over a homeless person on your way into Whole Foods.
How much racial shame they feel. And I would actually ask you to think about on a daily basis, how often do you, if you are white, feel racial shame? Seriously. Well, first of all, probably just when racism comes up, and even then. So maybe 2% of the time. I was in New York recently, and I stepped over a homeless man who was black on my way into Whole Foods, and I felt shame for just a minute.
Okay, but while I hope that I've made this overall approach seem as ridiculous as it is, I do want to offer an explicit, biologically grounded, like scientific refutation of this mode of analysis and thinking. And I'm going to do it with a little identity politics of my own. I'm going to do my own identity politics. Okay, so if I tell you, and it's true, if I tell you that I grew up in a cult and that I was physically and psychologically tortured on a daily basis, day in, day out, for years of my life, and if I further tell you about how I fought back against that abuse, and if I tell you about the actual forms that that abuse took, and I tell you about some of the psychological experiences that I had during the course of that abuse, if I tell you about some of the repercussions it had in my life, about, you know, the lifelong insomnia, the bouts of addiction, the homelessness and the madness and all the rest, two things are true. You know, one of them is because I experienced something truly, really pretty unique, because I existed in this one cult that had its own regime of torture that nobody else has experienced, that, you know, like a precise reiteration of ever. On one hand, I'm describing a way in which I've experienced something that you don't know the nature of, that you haven't experienced, and it's true that there is some level on which, you know, like you kind of can't imagine what that's like. But at the same time, if I were to actually describe a physical process that took place, if I were to describe a circumstance that I was in as a child that left psychological scars on me throughout the rest of my life, a part of your brain would literally have the experience of that thing happening to you. Right? Empathy is not, in the inane language of these babbling social scientists, empathy is not a social construct. Empathy is a neurologically very well-established fact. Here's a quote from a scientific paper called "The Neural Substrate of Human Empathy: Effects of Perspective Taking and Cognitive Appraisal." They define empathy in the following ways, as having the following components. 1, an affective response to another person, which some believe entails sharing that person's emotional state. 2, a cognitive capacity to take the perspective of the other person. And 3, some monitoring mechanisms that keep track of the origins, self versus other, of the experienced feelings. Depending on how empathy is triggered, the automatic tendency to mimic the expressions of others, bottom-up processing, and the capacity for the imaginative transposing of oneself into the feeling and thinking of another, top-down processing, may be differentially involved. It also seems likely that both processes rely upon, to some extent, neural mechanisms that are involved when the self experiences emotion. So they talk about the perception-action model of empathy, and how it's wrapped up in social interaction and the evolution of social cognition, which has been a very fundamental driver of human evolution in general. So they say this model posits that perception of emotion activates the neural mechanisms that are responsible for the generation of emotions. Such a system prompts the observer to resonate with the emotional state of another individual, with the observer activating the motor representations and associated autonomic and somatic responses that stem from the observed target, i.e., a sort of inverse mapping. For instance, a handful of functional magnetic resonance imaging studies have shown that the observation of pain in others is mediated by several brain areas that are implicated in processing the affective and motivational aspects of pain. And of course, because we don't want to discard the incessant injunctions to be cautious of acknowledging our limited perspectives that social scientists have so generously afforded us over and over again. So they also say, of course, that this isn't like a perfect system where you literally experience what somebody else is experiencing. They say it is not plausible, however, that this sharedness is absolute. A complete overlap between self and other representations would produce distress and hamper the ability to toggle between self and other perspectives. So, of course, there are limitations to our ability to empathize with others, but there's neural mechanisms involved that produce the experience on some level, on a neurological level that we're observing somebody else have. And these mechanisms of experiencing what we see other people experiencing are pretty exquisitely refined. There's this 2005 paper called Grasping the Intentions of Others with One's Own Mirror Neuron System. And they talk about this experiment they did where they showed people videos of these different stimuli where it's just a hand grasping a cup. But the hand is grasping in the cup in a couple different contexts, some of which imply drinking tea and some of which imply cleaning up. And so not only viewing the hand grasping the object in general produces a response where mirror neurons, describe the experience to the viewer of grasping something with their hand. But then also, depending on the context, mirror neurons themselves also generate the experience of either eating or cleaning up, right? They generate different differential responses in different brain regions that we expect are associated more with one or the other of those activities. Another paper describes some of the brain regions involved, says similar results were reported by Morrison, Lloyd, DiPellegrino, and Roberts, who applied a moderately painful pinprick stimulus to the fingertips of their participants and, in a second condition, showed them a video clip showing another person undergoing similar stimulation. Both conditions resulted in common hemodynamic activity in pain-related areas of the right cingulate cortex. And likewise, in another study, participants were shown photographs depicting right hands and feet in painful or neutral everyday life situations, and were asked to imagine the level of pain that these situations would produce. Significant activation in regions involved in the network processing the affective aspect of pain, notably the anterior medial cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, was detected. Moreover, the level of activity within the AMCC was strongly correlated with participants' mean ratings of pain attributed to the different situations. These results lend support to the idea that common neural circuits are involved in representing one's own and others' affective pain-related states. Yeah, this is literally what human cognition is made out of. It's made out of our capacity to understand the intentions and the states of others. We talked about this in episode 2 a bunch about how social cognition probably drove the overall cognitive capacities of humans, how probably all of our more abstract reasoning abilities are kind of like this really fortuitous, depending on how you look at it, but this this really remarkable sort of byproduct of an actual evolutionary pressure for social cognition to be able to better cooperate, to be able to better understand one another's intentions, to build better alliances within increasingly large, increasingly politically complex groups. We talked about how the neocortical volumes, the frontal region of the brains, the volume in a bunch of different primate species is correlated with group size. How it seems like the bigger the group, the more that they need that cognitive capacity that the neocortex provides to navigate the complexities of their social world. We talked about how 3-year-old humans and adult chimpanzees have very similar reasoning abilities with respect to the physical world, but human 3-year-olds have much more advanced capacities for reasoning about social situations, right? And the fact that language, our active social cognition, our paramount act of social cognition, is a phenomenon that we begin showing spontaneous neuromuscular development for. We start spontaneously babbling, and we learn language during a critical developmental window without explicit instruction, unlike other equally complex realms of knowledge like math, and so that's what makes notions like white fragility or like the entire standard social sciences model just such utter garbage, is that the statement that we simply can't comprehend what one another is experiencing is falsifiable by looking at our brains and seeing that people from different social groups all do show these fundamentally human neural signatures that, are it's not only the case that it's a pattern of brain activity that we all share, and thus that's an indication of our common humanity, but the pattern of brain activity itself indicates that we understand each other, that we are actively, that our brains, it's not only not the case that we live in mutually incomprehensible universes of like totally separate meaning, but it's actually the case that our brains are very specifically hardwired, are adapted to understand each other in the same way that that migratory birds' brains are wired to navigate with polarized light, in the same way that orcas' brains are wired to hear each other underwater over long distances. Our brains are wired to mentally represent what we see happening to other people and to imagine ourselves as them. This is really one of the very most fundamental human capacities. And any science that wants to deny that exists is not a real science. And what we also see is that there's tremendous variation between individuals, not between the social groups that social scientists and movements incessantly obsess over. The groups like, Palestinians versus Arabs versus people from Switzerland, like you do not see major like group level variation in, say, the degree of empathy, but you do see massive individual variation. And so any system of thought that doesn't acknowledge that, any system of thought that places whole sociological groups into categories where it's assumed that they have some kind of like common perceptual framework among themselves that other people don't possess, will always, if for instance a group is oppressed, it will always assume that any member of that group is equipotential to lead that group out of its oppression. But that's not. But what we know, if we stop listening to the babble of people like Rob and D'Angelo, and we look at what's happening in people's fucking brains, is that that's not true. That people actually have massively different levels of basic personality traits like empathy and aggression that dictate what their outlook will be like to situations of, social control and power and oppression and equality and inequality and all those really like fundamental visceral issues. So as far as the diffusion of these ideas out of academia and into movements, politics, I think the mechanism really is, just to recapitulate a common talking point of the right. I think the mechanism really is that a lot of people go to college and they're exposed to some version of this, however explicitly or implicitly. They're not necessary. It's not, I think it's a minority of people who end up going through college and having like all these debates explicitly about human nature, or surveying the particular like social science debates that we've reviewed in the series. But like I've said, there's also how this process manifests more often than not as a set of like rigorous, deeply integrated, explicit statements, but just as a tendency to emphasize, a tendency towards certain emphases over others. And so, what students are exposed to is this real tendency to just kind of like constantly orient towards particularity and differences between people, and assuming a lack of ability to comprehend other people's perspectives. And on a moral level, that's really wrapped up in respecting other people's perspectives. And so, of course, this is like one of those cases where, you never underestimate the power of the deliberate misapplication of a perfectly valid principle, because of course you should always approach people with real humility about the limitations of your perspective, and real humility about your ability to understand theirs, and that's just like, that's obviously how, that's obviously how we should engage with one another. And so that, and so many people and so many perspectives are really underrepresented in a lot of different forms of discourse, so that truth can always be invoked. But what people get accustomed to is that being the only truth that's invoked, and us never getting to the point where we look at what all these different perspectives have in common, and we speak about common humanity. And then I think that, so that's kind of like that's that aspect of the psychology of it. But I also think that one way that this really has diffused is just the tendency for people to emulate academic modes of rhetoric, and to adopt academic language simply because it feels sophisticated, for absolutely no other good reason. Like you see academic terminology diffuse out into culture all the time, and it's often pretty easy to tell that people just feel cool saying it. Like you see academics talk about unpacking a situation for a little while in their papers, like a certain genre of academics, and now you can't go to a conference without some facilitator saying that's a lot to unpack or whatever, right? Like the term postmodern, which just had so many different applications referring to so many different things, in part because people just thought it sounded really cool and they wanted to say it about architecture as well as fiction, as well as social conceptions of gender. And so that does play a role. The people who have really engaged in this kind of it's a trade-off. The people who have really engaged in this kind of thinking, the proponents of the social constructivist framework, have really, really strongly tended to be overtly dazzling with their language, to really lean in to like dense, florid academic language, and to just kind of overstated aesthetics of intelligentsia, Michel Foucault being a perfect example. But they've also, like the trade-off is, though, that it's actually a lot easier to do that kind of analysis. The people who do social constructivist analysis tend just not, they dismiss the relevance of biology, chemistry, and mathematics, but they also tend to not really know those subjects very well in a lot of cases. So it is kind of easier at the same time. And so, for those reasons, a lot of people get some level of indoctrinated, but whether or not people are exposed to any of the academic versions of the moral framework, that emphasis just has, through so many channels, through so many political meetings, through so many graduate students showing up at political meetings, through so many meetings that happened at campuses, that sort of like incessant tendency to adopt those three principles, that, you know, that focus on language, that radical overstating of differences between people, and that incessant tendency to interdict one's perspectives and evaluate their flaws. These tendencies have just like really developed. They've become associated over time with a moral weight, again, with always framed in terms of respecting other people's perspectives, and of trying to acknowledge, you know, the difficulties and the injustices and the terror, the horrors that other people are experiencing that you may not be perfectly well aware of. So, you know, it carries this moral weight that people really just kind of reflexively respond to. So, however precise of a characterization of like the pathways of diffusion of these tendencies out of academia and into our culture at large that is, you know, I think it does characterize broadly how that's happened. And so let's look at two examples of its impacts on political movements. The first being, and here again we get into, I'm going to talk about climate change, which I have spent a lot of my life attempting, however futilely, to intervene in the climate trajectory. And here we really get into the territory where we don't have, like, I went through White Fragility because it says something really explicit, because there's actually like a codified doctrine in there somewhere. And when we talk about movement work, as I've mentioned a number of other times, we just really don't have any kind of like analogous reference material most of the time. We don't have anything that's nearly as explicit. And so I do end up having to make a lot more generalizations and rely a lot more on anecdote. But so yeah, I mean, from my own experiences, I, for a very long time, tried desperately in a number of contexts through a variety of means with a hugely varied network of different people and groups to achieve this sort of like basic, what I kind of considered like a basic set of thresholds for a social movement to say that we were at all kind of just like even attempting to build something to respond to climate change, you know, essentially that like we had gotten to square one. And in practice, how this manifested was mostly a lot of driving around the Pacific Northwest, getting people to blockade oil trains. But there were also some moments of writing policies thrown in there, and doing like meta-analysis of various state and municipal climate plans, and showing common areas where they just didn't have any strategy whatsoever, identifying how some aspects of the economy had more like intrinsic barriers than others, and trying to like reframe the whole approach, you know. So the minimal criteria that I felt like we would have to meet to say that we kind of had like a movement that was attempting to intervene in the climate crisis in the Northwest was that we would be physically disrupting some aspect of the actual fossil fuel economy, of the extraction, transmission, or refining, or combustion, I suppose, of fossil fuels, and that we would have an explicit set of concrete policy measures for reductions in the use of resources and emissions. You know, I thought at a minimum of 15% per annum reduction in emissions and resource usage, and that we would tie that, we would have like a pretty serious movement that was tying that to a set of just sort of broader social policies, because this would imply such massive disruptions for, you know, like just life as we know it. That would tie it to a broader set of social policies, like, for instance, universal basic income, whatever other kinds of community infrastructure that would be built to accommodate a radical restructuring of our lives, then I also felt like we would have to have sort of like a culture war going on, where we were really pushing this in terms of other aspects of human psychological need, not as like a moral imperative, not any kind of like it'll be horrible, billions will die, but just as a like we don't want to go to work kind of cultural movement, like a movement away from consumerism and the resource extractive economy, that, so like tying big picture, like municipal and state policy platforms about things like universal basic income, community centers, housing, and things like that, to like a legitimate grassroots culture that was just more fun than what was happening in the world, as in the consumer civilization that we're all kind of inhabiting on some level or another. And then like massive disruptions of the fossil fuel economy, and a very specific concrete set of policy measures, reductions in the distribution. It's not actually like that complicated. Everything that people talk about with climate policy is mostly actually an adaptation to what would really be climate policy. You don't need to actually calculate every infinite vicissitude of energy use or transportation or anything like that to do climate policy. You just need to turn off the fossil fuels. You just need to stop burning them. And then everything else happens as an adaptation, But so a set of measures that were like distributing less and less gasoline to gas stations, things like that, closing off major areas of the city to vehicular traffic, rezoning industrial areas that transmitted, that were like transloading facilities for fossil fuels, rezoning them as like protected nature areas. Things like that all had some kind of actual legal mechanism in place. They would have induced a conflict. There would have been lawsuits. There would have been jurisdictional issues. But, where there is at least some kind of semi-plausible legal mechanism whereby a movement can be kind of like constituted to pursue, a fairly clear objective. And while I certainly worked with a number of amazing people over the years, the part and did receive a good deal of encouragement from a very limited number of people. At the level of groups and entire movements, over and over again, when myself and a handful of friends would show up and say, we're going to blockade these trains, and here's our map where we've rezoned the city of Portland, and we want to recommend that this industrial corridor turns into an extension of Forest Park. Over and over again, what we were told, anytime that we brought concrete policy proposals around, was that this was like an injustice, and that the correct thing to do wasn't to propose responses to the climate crisis. The correct thing to do was to seek out unconsulted perspectives, right? That we should always assume that our own perspective was so contingent and imperfect and contaminated with a number of insidious social tendencies that we unconsciously were inculcated into, and so that we should just be seeking out different perspectives. And that so this is again where it becomes hard to definitively state, to make like to make a reference to anything that can like really justify the statement, but that literally was the approach of these groups year after year, at the expense of ever actually formulating specific goals that anybody could envision, that any objectives that you could say, this is what we want the world to look like. And nobody would ever say, we're just going to keep searching for more unconsulted perspectives that we hadn't yet considered to consult forever, right? And, nobody would ever literally say that, but that simply was the case. And I mean, of course, like it's again, this is like a totally valid principle in and of itself. Like, of course, if you're actually going to be like developing a coalition or really presenting some policy that you think, if you think you're in a position of any kind of power, yeah, I mean, obviously, you should seek out as many allies as possible. You should seek out as many perspectives as possible. You should always come in, representing the most robust, diverse coalition you can. That's great. But they're thinking the notion that it was somehow doing violence to other people to articulate one set of possibilities just utterly baffled me, right? Because I think that the opposite is true, than that there should be like some movement somewhere that hammers out the one great set of climate truths that everybody then works towards. I mean, I think it seems manifestly self-evident to me that we hugely benefit by there being a very rich landscape of well-developed perspectives on what a world in which we're not destroying ourselves could look like. And that the more that we have like a real, like a vast wilderness of like competing frameworks and complementary notions and overlapping but distinct ideas, and like the better off we are, the more power we develop and the more plausibility towards any other kind of existence we develop, the more that there's a lot of different ideas out there about how we could live. But it is just not something that you will find in the climate change landscape. You will not find advocates who are capable of or willing to just really specifically describe the actual, like, which machine gets turned off and what sequence, like where, just like how things are going to look in the most basic of ways. And yeah, over and over again, when I would have these conversations, and again, this is the best I can do. I just have to rely on anecdote. But over and over again, when I would have these conversations, I mean, people would literally sound like the beginning of an ethnography, where the anthropologist is like, here's all my contingent perspectives, here's all the ways in which I'm applying my own notions of these various things onto these other situations that might be different. Here's why we should always just kind of hesitate to draw any conclusions. Here's all my imperfection. It's just like, it's really shocking and at the same time tedious how much, when you're having these political discussions and people are invoking these reasons to not do things, how much they just sound like a social sciences department in like 1972, which again is this thing, like this type of thinking really is like pretty marginal in academia now, but it just continues to hugely shape politics. And then I also wanted to talk about the movement against the police and prisons. So these movement discussions around policing and police violence, incarceration, and race, I mean, they really tend to assiduously avoid data. And so I'm just going to lead with some statistics. Estimates vary a little bit, but something much like 700 people for every 100,000 people are incarcerated in the United States. This is a much higher per capita rate of incarceration than has ever been found in any society anywhere in the entire world. Police also kill a breathtaking number of people. And so to break this down by ethnicity, whites have the lowest overall rate of police killings, 3.3 per million people, followed by Latinos, 3.5 per million, and for Black people, it's 7.9 per million. So then what kind of white person you are certainly has everything to do with how likely you are to be killed by the police. Between January 1st, 2015 and June 9th, 2020, the rate of police killings among the poorest fifth of white people was 7.9 per million, whereas the rate of police killings among the second poorest fifth of black folks was a little lower, 7.7 per million. So, how often you encounter the police killings are actually, the police killing rate is actually about the same per encounter. So police just police black people a lot more than other people, so there's more encounters, and so they kill more black people. The actual rates of killings are about the same per encounter. So we can draw any number of pretty basic conclusions from this state of affairs. We can say that the United States carceral system is a shocking monstrosity and that it should absolutely be dismantled right the fuck away. We can say that there are radical disparities racially and economically in who goes to jail and who gets killed by the police. But, and here, again, like, there's not really like an explicit, there's not like an explicit thesis that I can refer to and say, here is the movement paradigm. But this is a lot less in need of any real introduction than say like climate work. Most people are familiar with some versions of these debates, and what I don't think we can say from these data is that black people and white people, for instance, live in totally conceptually incommensurate, like utterly mutually incomprehensible universes of distinct meaning, in that there's like a black experience and a white experience, and they have nothing in common. I think it is much, much, much more reasonable and valid to say that we can talk about actual things that actually happen in the corporeal fucking world, and we can say that they happen to black people more often than white people. But the actual thing, when it's experienced by whoever happens to be subject to it, and that the experience of incarceration and being killed by the police ain't really all that different between black people and white people. But over and over again, movement framing has taken this approach, has diffused out of its obscure academic origins. And I think that a thing that is worth noting about it is that it's not a framework. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, this would have seemed bewilderingly academic. The notion that it is racist to say that people of different ethnicities have similar experiences would have been a bafflingly academic proposition so recently to people of all ethnicities. Right. And it's just become very recently, certainly in my lifetime, that it's become like the consensus, the virtual consensus position, the majoritarian position in social movements, that comparison, like about uniformities of experience between people in different groups, like different ethnic groups, is somehow like in and of itself oppressive, and that appealing to common interest somehow negates or diminishes the experiences that other people are having. And what I think is tragic about this, because ultimately white people are, I don't know, like 75% of the United States population, and because, ultimately because of that larger overall share of the population, that, white people, there's more white people being killed by police than black people. And what's so tragic about the situation is that the way that movements against police violence function right now is almost like as fervently as possible to exclude some of those people, some of those white people who also feel threatened by the police, from feeling like they have a valid basis for participation. If the criterion for entry into a movement against policing is to acknowledge that the experience of being abused by the police is a black experience, and that white people are there to witness and to support black people as they talk about the experience that only they have of being fucked with by the cops, then like there are a whole lot. Like I feel personally, I mean, I was arrested for the first time when I was 8. I come from a pretty chronically incarcerated family, and I cannot count the number of times I've been arrested. I used to really feel like I couldn't walk down the street without going to jail. Like a lot of people who experienced extreme abuse when they were young, I was a drug addict for a very long time. There is, in fact, a war on drugs out there, which is actually a war on drug users. There are, in fact, men who just drive around looking for people who are in so much pain, because there's a big statistical correlation between abuse and addiction, looking for people who are in so much pain that they're chasing it away with substances, and they're trying to take those people and put them into cages where more of the same bad things will happen to them that drove them to addiction in the first place. Like, I feel pretty good and fucked with by the cops in this life. And I feel when I'm on the streets in anti-police marches, or when I'm listening to people talk about it, like, I'm essentially being told over and over again that the experiences that I've had aren't valid. And I don't really care enough. Like, I certainly don't care enough not to show up at the march or whatever, but it torments me because I know perfectly well that there's other people who've had similar experiences who just feel a little bit less benevolent about it and are just alienated from movements like that, and just feel like it's essentially nonsense because they feel like they're being told that what they've experienced personally isn't real. And again, because people can just look at statistics and see that the statement that policing in prisons only exists as a function of race just isn't true. The rate of incarceration in Idaho, somebody pointed out in a fairly recent article in the Catalyst Journal, Idaho is virtually all white. The rate of incarceration is a little higher than the national average. I likewise grew up places that were, I've made this point a bunch of times, like, there's places where it's really just white people, and there are still police. And so, this statement that Black people have this totally conceptually distinct experience of interacting with the police, that all Black people universally and immediately just understand, and that no white people ever grasp, even if they themselves or their family members happen to have been incarcerated or beaten up by the cops or whatever. I mean, it's one of the most horribly unstrategic approaches that one could ever conceive of. And I think that one way, one way to talk about white fragility, or the way movements frame groups and alliances and talk about what groups can comprehend what experiences of what other groups, is in terms of 20th century social constructivism, in terms of Foucault, all that good stuff that we've already done. But another way to characterize these approaches is to say that you take everything Fred Hampton said and do the exact opposite.
What makes them mad about it is that they have Black people and white poor people and red poor people and Puerto Rican poor people and Latin American Puerto Rican people of poor people of all descents. They had them caught up in movements based on racism when the Black Panther Party stood up and said that we don't care what anybody says. We don't think you fight fire with fire best. We think you fight fire with water best. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We said we're not going to fight capitalism with Black capitalism, but we're going to fight it with socialism. We stood up and said we're not going to fight reactionary pigs and reactionary state's attorneys like this and reactionary state's attorneys like Hanrahan with any other reactions on our part.
And that's why Fred Hampton was assassinated by the Chicago Police Department in his bed and Robin DiAngelo wasn't, right? Because Fred Hampton is a threat to their system, and Robin DiAngelo just gives you material to consider while you're stepping over homeless people on your way into Whole Foods.
We're going to fight their reactions where all of us people are getting together and have an international proletarian revolution. Right on. And that's saying all power to the people. Right on. That's saying that no matter what color you are, there's only two classes. And that's saying that there's a class over here and there's a class over there. And the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off its back, because this is lower, this is upper. This is the oppressed, this is the oppressor. This is the exploited, this is the exploiter. And these people in this class have divided themselves. They say, I'm black, and I hate white people. I'm white, and I hate black people. I'm Latin American, and I hate hillbillies. I'm hillbilly, and I hate Indians. So we fighting amongst each other. And you've heard the testimony of pigs here. You got pigs of all colors. You know that.
Because in the end, the fundamental question is whether or not we can build a big enough coalition to defeat the existing power structure. The question is always about one of unity. And that's why divide and conquer is the oldest strategic maxim of hierarchical conquesting powers. And this social sciences framework that has diffused into activism has functioned to simply keep us painfully divided along the exact same lines that we have been trying to overcome for a very long time, but making it feel somehow like liberatory or like a pursuit of justice to keep these lines of division as sharp as possible and to keep our ability to understand one another as minimal as possible. And that, my friends, is where I'm going to say we will end our tour of the social sciences and their often uncredited contributions to our political dialogue. I guess if I hope there's one thing in particular that people got out of this, it's that I hope to borrow the phraseology of the social scientists I've just spent 4 episodes mocking and critiquing. I hope it's that people see that the language and the frames and the modes of reasoning and some of the seemingly intuitive designations of group status and relationships between groups and between different forms of power that are very prevalent within our political landscape right now. I hope that I've illustrated how really ultimately very contingent and limited those perspectives actually are, how they came about in a very specific time and place as a consequence of very specific obsessions on the part of people who neither had a meaningful claim towards really any kind of valid, what we would call science, nor people who were really meaningfully engaged in any kind of social struggle that we would care about or respect at all. And how these absurd notions, with all of the unanticipated consequences that it engendered, that people ended up defending, really just came about because of some very, very simple psychological need, because of like a fear reaction to the notion that human nature implied something politically undesirable. And I guess what I hope more than anything to give people a sense of is considering how much is at stake, considering the incredible work that we have to do and how much we are in the middle of losing, how desperately poorly this battle is going. I think that it hopefully just seems evident that it would be ridiculous for us to actually be constrained in the possibilities we considered and the actions we took by the kind of fearful, self-indulgent, pretentious, and at the time pretty irrelevant texts that people were writing in anthropology departments in like 1934 or whatever. And so, yeah, I guess my motivation for doing this, because there have certainly been, although I don't think anybody's gone really like precisely on the journey that we just went on, there's certainly been a number of, professors, scientists, whoever, there's really a whole genre of people who are talking about kind of like the broad anti-scientific tendencies that are evident in those echelons of academia that we've been talking about, and in students and in social movements and in the current socio-political discourse. And there's certainly like any number of like professors of cognitive science or whatever writing pieces where they're like the illiberal tradition, like the illiberal tendency among students that I'm encountering is highly disturbing. This was particularly true a few years ago. And in some of those, texts have good points. Some of them contain statements I disagree with. But I think for me, the point is that they don't really come from a movement perspective. They don't, and this is where we can validate those social scientists and be like, yeah, the the contingent perspective actually really matters. And so, like, I guess I conceive of this mostly as a cultural project to place some of those same critiques and some of those same basic oppositions to the fundamentally anti-rational processes that these social scientists promoted that have been adopted by movements, to place opposition to that in a movement context, to frame it in terms of strategy and in terms of like broad kind of like worldview analysis around the core crises that we are currently navigating and that we may not survive. It's me wanting to take that language and place it into a context where the urgency of fighting for our lives is acknowledged. And I really actually think, I guess another motivation for having done this is that I really believe that the stories we tell actually matter, that the theories we have about how the world works really are very, very important. And I think that it's a cliche that once you lie once, you're caught in this infinite, reciprocally informed, ever magnifying loop of lies that you have to perpetuate to defend the initial untruth. And I think that the story of social sciences that we've just told is one really clear case of that, where the initial lies had these really simple motivations that were, I don't know, kind of manifested some weakness, some psychological, moral, analytical, scientific laziness and weakness, but were understandable on some level, were sympathetic. But then the lies that had to be defended to defend that initial lie became more and more insidious. And, so I think that I have always been really kind of astonished as I've done movement work over and over again, seeing how it really does feel like these academic debates have translated into real consequential barriers to things that I'd like to see happen. And so I'd like to think that the converse is true as well, that if we explicitly say, however academic it might seem to say, there is human nature, here's some things we can say about it, we don't know the ultimate range of behavioral variation that humans are capable of, that certainly has not yet been determined, but here are some regularities we can observe about human life, and here are some like broad possible trajectories, or here are some like general parameters we think future societies might have. I think that actually doing this I think just being explicit and inhabiting the truth will have, if that becomes a more widespread approach, naming innateness, if that becomes a more widespread approach, I think that it will have consequences that are just as difficult and just to anticipate as the consequences of this other mode of social sciences that we've been critiquing has had. And I think they'll be just as difficult to explicitly anticipate. I just think that it would be profoundly valuable for us to have a rich framework of shared meaning that actually referred to a real world that we could all collectively observe, and that we would achieve unity much better in such a circumstance. So I thank you so much for listening. I have so many episodes planned. I have so many outlines. I have been doing so much reading. I have so many notes. I'm going to be bringing some folks in for a couple episodes. I think the next episode I will have somebody with me, and we will be talking about one of two things. So I'm not gonna describe the myriad themes that we're gonna be investigating, but it's gonna be exciting. And if circumstances, admittedly somewhat beyond my control, like the level of ambient, the level of smoke in the air, but if circumstances are at all accommodating, we should have some more episodes pretty soon. So until then, friends, take care and talk to you soon.
Yes, but at the human level, when we make that move, right? Get race off the table and let's position some kind of shared universal experience. There isn't one in this physical plane that we live in a society deeply separate and unequal by race.
Got pigs that are white, got pigs that are black, you even got pigs that are black and white.